Every December, images of Bethlehem fill the world. Painted, photographed, lit up in store windows, pressed into greeting cards, assembled from plastic figures on mantelpieces across every continent. The image is consistent across all of them. A still night, a star, animals at rest, a family in a stable, shepherds approaching from the dark fields outside. What is almost never in that image is money, commerce, labor, the specific economic structures that made Bethlehem what it was, that determined who lived there, what they did, how much of what they produced they got to keep, and what the relationship was between this small Judean highland town and the two larger economic systems pressing down on it from above, the Roman imperial machine and the Jerusalem temple establishment. This is the paradox of Bethlehem's economic history. The most depicted town in the world is also one of the least examined towns in the world, at least in terms of how its people actually survived. The nativity paintings tell us nothing about the tax structure that brought Joseph and Mary there in the first place. The Christmas carols say nothing about the specific industries that sustained Bethlehem's population year in and year out. The pilgrimages that have flowed to the site for 17 centuries are organized around what happened there, not around the economic conditions that shaped the place where it happened. And yet, those economic conditions are recoverable. The archaeology of the site and its surroundings, the ancient historical sources, and the logic of a small agricultural community in the Judean highlands under Roman occupation combine to produce a picture of Bethlehem's economy that is specific, textured, and, once you see it, essential to understanding everything else about the place, because how people made money in Bethlehem tells you who held power there, who was vulnerable, what the relationship was between the village and the city, 8 kilometers to the north, and why a family from Galilee arriving for a Roman census would have found not an empty town with room in every inn, but a town under pressure in every direction. There is a reason the economic history of Bethlehem has not been told. It is not that the information is unavailable. The sources, the archaeology, and the historical logic are all accessible to anyone willing to look. It is that the economic history of Bethlehem sits in permanent tension with the devotional image of Bethlehem, and devotional images have, for 2,000 years, had considerably more cultural force than economic history. The stable is serene. The economic system that made a family sleep in a stable is not. Today we are going to follow the money in Bethlehem, through its fields and its flocks, through its olive orchards and its quarries, through its position on a road that connected Jerusalem to the south and to Egypt, through the specific economic weight of being the town that supplied lambs to the temple, and through the layers of taxation and obligation that extracted from all of it before any of it reached the families who had produced it. The shepherd and the temple supply chain begin with the shepherd, because in Bethlehem's case, shepherding was not simply a pastoral occupation. It was a specific commercial activity with a specific institutional customer, the temple in Jerusalem, 8 kilometers to the north. The temple's daily operations required an uninterrupted supply of unblemished animals. The twice-daily Tamid sacrifice, 2 male lambs without blemish offered morning and afternoon, every single day of the year, was the baseline. On top of the regular sacrifice, the temple received thousands of individual offerings: sin offerings, guilt offerings, peace offerings, Nazirite completion offerings, first fruits offerings. Each of these required an animal that had passed the temple's inspection as ritually acceptable. Each rejected animal was a lost sale and a pilgrim's disrupted obligation. The quality control requirements of the temple's supply chain were among the strictest in the ancient world. Bethlehem and its surrounding hills were identified in ancient tradition as one of the primary zones for raising the flocks destined for temple sacrifice. The watchtower called Migdal Eder, the Tower of the Flock, mentioned in the Book of Micah and associated in later rabbinic tradition, specifically with the flocks raised for temple use, was located in the Bethlehem area. The shepherds who worked those hills were not ordinary shepherds keeping mixed flocks for their own households. They were specialists in a specific commercial enterprise, producing animals that met the temple's standards, maintaining the quality and cleanliness requirements that inspection would verify, and moving those animals the 8 kilometers to Jerusalem at the appropriate times. This specialization had economic consequences. A shepherd raising temple-quality lambs was producing a premium commodity for a buyer with very specific requirements. The temple's purchasing power was substantial. The annual volume of sacrificial animals processed in Jerusalem, particularly during festival seasons, was enormous. Josephus's descriptions of Passover preparations make the scale concrete. Tens of thousands of lambs slaughtered in the compressed period of Passover preparation, a river of blood flowing down the Temple Mount's drainage channels into the Kidron Valley. The economics of this supply chain were not straightforward, however. The families raising the flocks did not necessarily control the prices at which their animals were sold. The priestly families who administered the temple also controlled or influenced the licensing of animal dealers in the temple complex, the same dealers who sold animals to pilgrims at inflated prices. The shepherd who raised a lamb from birth and walked it to Jerusalem had to navigate between what the dealer would pay him and what the dealer could charge the pilgrim. The spread between those two prices was the dealer's profit, and the dealer's position was protected by institutional relationships that the shepherd could not access. The relationship between the Bethlehem shepherds and the temple supply chain had a specific operational dimension that deserves attention. The animals designated for temple sacrifice were not simply ordinary livestock sold to the highest bidder. They had to meet criteria: no blemish, no broken bones, no skin conditions, appropriate age that required the shepherds to manage their flocks with the temple's inspection standards in mind throughout the animals' lives. A lamb that developed a minor injury before reaching the inspection point was a financial loss for the shepherd, not a recoverable situation. This required a specific kind of attentive husbandry, watching the animals constantly, managing the grazing terrain to minimize injury risk, making judgments about which animals in each season's newborns were candidates for temple sale and which would go to other markets. The nighttime watch that Luke's account describes, shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night, was not romantic pastoral imagery. It was a practical operational requirement. Nighttime was when predators moved. It was also when the flock was most vulnerable to the injuries that would disqualify an animal from temple sale. A shepherd who lost several lambs in a single night to a wolf or a dog pack had lost not only the animals, but the time and investment of raising them to qualification. The watch was economically motivated, and the men keeping it were doing skilled commercial work, not living out a bucolic scene. The first economic subject of Bethlehem's story, then, is a shepherd caught in a supply chain that required his expertise and his labor, that connected his hillside directly to the most sacred institution in the Jewish world, and that distributed the revenues from that connection predominantly toward Jerusalem rather than toward the hills where the animals were raised. The shepherd of Bethlehem supplied the temple. The temple was not primarily supplying the shepherd, the grain farmer, and the tax machine. The fields around Bethlehem were among the most productive in the Judean highlands. The Rephaim Valley to the northwest of the town, the agricultural terraces that climbed the slopes in every direction, the flat areas around the town's edges, all of these supported the grain cultivation that was Bethlehem's other primary economic activity. Wheat and barley, the staple crops of the ancient Near East, grew in the deep soil of the valley floors. The harvest in spring was the year's most important single event, determining whether the household would eat adequately or face deficit in the months ahead. The Book of Ruth said explicitly in Bethlehem's fields during the barley harvest, that provides the most detailed ancient portrait of this agricultural life. The gleaning laws that Ruth benefited from, the obligation of landowners to leave the edges of their fields unharvested for the poor, the widow, and the foreigner, were not incidental provisions. They were part of an agricultural system that acknowledged the precariousness of the position of those without land. The fact that Ruth needed to glean, that Naomi needed her to glean, that the entire survival strategy of these two women depended on the goodwill of a landowner following provisions that the law required, but that could be administered generously or minimally. All of this describes an agricultural economy in which land ownership was the determinant of security and landlessness was the condition of permanent vulnerability. In the first century, the tax structure overlying this agricultural reality was the primary mechanism by which family security was converted into institutional revenue. Rome demanded tribute assessed against agricultural production and payable in cash, which required selling portions of the harvest even when the household needed that harvest to eat. The temple required agricultural tithes, a first tithe of 10% to the Levites, a second tithe to be consumed in Jerusalem during festival weeks, and in certain years a third tithe designated for the poor. Herod's client state demanded its own levies. The aggregate extraction could reach 30 to 40% of annual production. On a subsistence margin, on a system that, in a good year, produced just enough for a family to survive, pay its obligations, and set aside seed for the next planting. 30 to 40% was not inconvenience. It was the mechanism of progressive dispossession. The bad harvest year required borrowing. The loan was secured against the land. The interest, though technically prohibited by the Torah for lending between Jews, was structured through legal instruments that achieved its practical effect. The land, which the Torah designated as inalienable family inheritance, became over time the property of creditors in Jerusalem who had the capital to extend loans and the legal sophistication to prevent the Torah's debt relief provisions from operating. The grain farmer of Bethlehem, harvesting his barley in the spring, was harvesting something that, before it reached his family's storage jars, had to pass through the hands of the tax collector, the tithe administrator, and the creditor. What remained was what his family would eat. In a good year, it was enough. In a bad year, a drought, a locust swarm, a hailstorm, it was not, and the gap between what remained and what was needed was filled by a loan that the family might not survive economically. The gleaning economy that Ruth navigated was not incidental to Bethlehem's agricultural life. It was a structural feature of it. The Torah's provisions for the poor, the obligation to leave the edges of fields unharvested, to allow gleaners to follow the reapers, to not go back for forgotten sheaves, created a specific secondary economy operating alongside the primary one. This was not charity in the modern sense, a voluntary transfer from the wealthy to the poor. It was a legal obligation built into the agricultural system. Now a recognition that the harvest depended on labor and conditions that no individual family controlled, and that the surplus beyond what the owner needed belonged partly to those who had nothing. The Bethlehem of the first century still had this system in formal operation, at least as an ideal. Whether it was consistently practiced is another question. The same forces that had stripped families of their land, the debt system, the tax pressure, the concentration of agricultural surplus toward Jerusalem, were also forces that created incentives for landowners to minimize their gleaning obligations. A landowner who had mortgaged the next 3 harvests to service a debt had reason to harvest as completely as possible, leaving the minimum that the law required rather than the generous margin that the spirit of the provision envisioned. The gleaning economy was, like the Jubilee and the sabbatical debt release, a provision of the Torah that the first century's economic pressures had narrowed toward formal compliance rather than substantive practice. The second economic subject of Bethlehem's story is a grain farmer working fields that the Book of Ruth described in their best light as generous with their gleanings, and that the first century tax system had converted into a mechanism for extracting from families who worked them until the families no longer owned them. The olive grower and the slow economy of generations. The olive trees on the slopes above Bethlehem were among the oldest living things in the landscape. An olive tree planted in the Judean highlands can produce fruit for centuries. The trees that were producing olives in the first century of the Common Era may have been planted by ancestors whose names no one remembered. The olive orchards were not, in any simple sense, an investment with a return. They were inherited relationships with the land, obligations to the past, and resources for the future simultaneously. Olive cultivation in the highlands followed a rhythm that was both agricultural and social. The harvest, conducted in autumn by beating the branches with long poles and collecting the fallen olives on cloth spread below, required the labor of the entire household and often the assistance of neighbors. The pressing that followed in the heavy stone mills, where a circular stone rotated over the olives, was another collective operation, not something a single family could manage alone. The oil that resulted served cooking, lighting, medicine, and ritual anointing, and was valuable enough to be a standard medium of payment and exchange. But the olive economy had a specific vulnerability that made it more susceptible than grain to the debt system that was extracting rural land toward Jerusalem. A grain field could be abandoned for a season and replanted. An olive orchard required 10 years to establish before it produced significantly. A family that lost its olive orchard to debt foreclosure was losing not only a current asset, but the accumulated investment of a generation, the trees that a parent or grandparent had planted and tended through the years of their establishment. The loss was not only economic, it was a severance from the family's investment in the future, by a breaking of the chain of inheritance that the Torah had designated as the fundamental structure of family life on the land. The ancient sources document this process of orchard loss with sufficient consistency to make clear it was not exceptional. The wealthier families of Jerusalem accumulated olive orchards in the surrounding countryside through exactly the mechanism described above. Loans extended in bad years secured against the orchard, with legal instruments preventing the debt from being canceled. The olive oil that was pressed in Bethlehem's mills from olives grown on Bethlehem's slopes flowed upward to Jerusalem in increasing proportions as the century progressed. The olive press season in Bethlehem was also a moment of communal economic tension. The families whose olives were being pressed alongside each other in the communal mill were families whose economic interests were not always aligned. A family that owed debt service to a creditor had reason to sell its oil quickly for cash, accepting a lower price to meet an immediate obligation. A family without pressing debt obligations could wait for better market conditions. The press itself, shared, meant that the sequence of pressing mattered. Earlier in the season, when the olives were first ripe, produced different oil than later, when the fruit had fully matured. The management of communal agricultural infrastructure was always also the management of relationships, obligations, and the specific kind of social tension that arises when people with different economic pressures share the tools on which they all depend. The third economic subject of Bethlehem's story is an olive grower whose trees preceded him and whose connection to them was as much genealogical as commercial, and whose economy was being slowly converted through the accumulation of bad harvests and the interest that the law prohibited and the practice enabled, from ownership to tenancy in the orchards his family had planted. The stonecutter and the building economy Bethlehem sat on a ridge of limestone that was among the finest building stone in the Judean highlands. The pale limestone of the region, soft enough to be worked with iron tools, hard enough to endure for millennia, bright enough to gleam in the sun with the particular brilliance that makes the stone buildings of the Judean highlands distinctive, was in constant demand for construction throughout the region. Jerusalem, 8 kilometers to the north, was in a state of essentially continuous construction throughout the 1st century BCE and into the 1st century CE, driven primarily by Herod the Great's ambitions and the temple rebuilding project that employed 10,000 workers at its peak. The stonecutters of Bethlehem and its neighboring villages supplied material to these projects. The quarrying of limestone was skilled work. The cutter had to read the rock's natural fracture lines, know where to place the wedges to split cleanly along the desired plane, understand which faces of the quarry face would yield the large blocks needed for construction, and which would yield only rubble. Skilled stone cutters were not interchangeable laborers. They were practitioners of a craft that required years of learning, passed within families and workshops across generations. The demand from Jerusalem's construction projects created a specific labor market for Bethlehem's stonecutters. A craftsman who could quarry and dress limestone to specification had access to cash wages that purely agricultural workers did not. The building economy of 1st century Judea centered in Jerusalem, but drawing on the stone resources of the surrounding countryside, provided income to families in the villages around the city that supplemented what the land produced. Just as the Sepphoris rebuilding project supplemented income for craftsmen in Nazareth. The connection between Bethlehem's stone and Jerusalem's construction extended to something more specific and more symbolically charged: the building of the temple itself. Herod's reconstruction of the Temple Mount used limestone from the quarries of the Jerusalem region, some of the largest cut stone blocks in the ancient world, weighing hundreds of tons, are still visible in the Western Wall. Whether specific quarries in Bethlehem's vicinity contributed to this work is not documented with certainty, but the participation of Judean highland villages in the temple building economy is consistent with what we know of 1st century Judean construction practice. The quarrying and transport of stone from Bethlehem's vicinity to Jerusalem involved a logistics chain that employed people at multiple levels: the quarrymen who cut and split the stone, the dressers who shaped the cut blocks to specification, the transport workers who loaded the blocks onto sledges or carts and moved them along the road to Jerusalem, the suppliers who kept the quarrymen and transport workers fed and watered during the working days. None of these workers owned the quarries or the construction projects. They sold their labor for daily wages that the ancient sources suggest ranged from 1 to a few denarii per day for unskilled work and somewhat more for skilled stone cutting. A denarius was, by the accounts in the Gospels, a standard day's wage for a laboring man, enough to feed a family for one day, with nothing left over for savings or unexpected costs. The work was seasonal in a specific way. The major construction projects in Jerusalem created demand surges that did not always align with the agricultural calendar. A craftsman who could leave the farm during the slack months of late winter and early spring to work on a Jerusalem building project had a source of income that bridged the gap between the harvest season agricultural income and the next harvest. This supplementary income was not a bonus. For families with thin margins, it was often the difference between meeting their tax obligations and falling into arrears. There is a specific irony available here that the ancient sources leave implicit. The stone cutters of Bethlehem, working quarries in the hills around the town where Jesus was born, may have contributed their labor and their material to the construction of the temple that would, within the lifetime of the people doing that work, be identified by a prophet from the same town as a structure that would not leave one stone upon another. The building economy connected Bethlehem to Jerusalem in stone. The prophetic tradition connected Bethlehem to Jerusalem in judgment. The road south, commerce, pilgrimage, and the traffic through Bethlehem. Bethlehem's position on the road system of first-century Judea gave it an economic dimension beyond its agricultural and craft production. The town sat on the main route running south from Jerusalem, the road that connected the capital to Hebron, to the Negev, and eventually to Egypt. This was not a peripheral route. It was one of the primary arteries of the region, carrying trade goods, military movements, administrative correspondence, and the foot traffic of ordinary people moving between the highland cities of Judea. The economic activity generated by a road through a town was substantial in the ancient world, because roads in first-century Judea were the only means of moving goods, and because the people and animals traveling those roads needed food, water, lodging, animal feed, minor repairs to equipment, and the 100 other services that sustained travel. A town on a significant road had a permanent commercial activity that purely agricultural villages off the road lacked. Bethlehem's specific position on the road south also connected it to the pilgrimage traffic that moved through the region 3 times a year. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem from the south, from Hebron, from the Negev, from communities in Idumea, and even from Egypt, would have passed through or near Bethlehem on their way to the Holy City. The pilgrimage traffic created a seasonal intensification of the commercial activity that the road generated year-round. More people, more animals, more need for the services the town could provide, and more opportunity for the town's producers to sell their goods directly to the pilgrim market rather than waiting for the market to come to them. The census that brought Joseph and Mary from Nazareth to Bethlehem was not an unusual displacement of people along these roads. The Roman census system, which required registration in ancestral hometowns, created exactly the kind of population movement that the road infrastructure was designed to handle. Families who had been scattered across the region by the normal migrations of economic life converged on their ancestral towns, filling the available accommodation and straining the food supply. Bethlehem, as a town with ancestral connection to the House of David, would have received a disproportionate number of people with Davidic genealogy, a category that, in the context of first-century Jewish messianic expectation, was not negligible. The commercial services that Bethlehem offered to road traffic were more varied than a simple list of lodging and food suggests. Animals traveling with merchants or pilgrims needed fodder and water. Equipment broke and needed repair. Sandal straps, pack harnesses, cart wheels. People fell ill on the road and needed whatever treatment the town's healers could provide. Merchants moving goods south needed porters and guides for the next difficult section of the road. Pilgrims unfamiliar with the route needed information about water sources, safe camping spots, and the condition of the road ahead. All of these services generated small commercial transactions that, accumulated across the year's traffic, represented a meaningful supplement to the agricultural economy's seasonal income. The position of Bethlehem, 8 kilometers south of Jerusalem, also made it a staging point for people who needed to be near Jerusalem but could not or would not stay in the city. During major festivals, when Jerusalem was overwhelmed with pilgrims, Bethlehem could absorb some of the overflow. Pilgrims who arrived too late to find accommodation in Jerusalem itself, or who preferred the lower costs of a nearby town, would walk the 8 kilometers each day to the temple courts and returned to Bethlehem in the evening. The census that filled Bethlehem to capacity with ancestral registrants was an intensified version of a pressure the town was already accustomed to managing during Passover week. The town that the census filled was therefore already a town with commercial infrastructure oriented toward travelers. The inns and guest rooms, the food vendors, the water suppliers, the animal fodder merchants, all of these existed in Bethlehem before the census because the road through the town had required them. The census did not create a commercial town out of a pastoral village. It overwhelmed a town that already had commercial capacity with a demand that exceeded that capacity. So the priestly economy, Bethlehem's connection to the Levitical system. One of the least discussed aspects of Bethlehem's economic life is its connection to the priestly and Levitical system that administered the temple's revenues. The 24 divisions of priests that served in rotation at the temple were drawn from communities throughout Judea and Galilee. Several of these priestly divisions had their home communities in or near the Bethlehem area. When the division was not serving in Jerusalem, its members lived in their home communities, farming their land, participating in the local economy, and receiving the portions of the tithes and offerings that the Levitical system entitled them to. The economic consequence of having priestly families resident in a community was not trivial. My priestly families had entitlements, portions of sacrificial offerings, first fruits contributions, tithes from the agricultural production of the area that represented a flow of resources toward them from the communities they lived in. A small town like Bethlehem, with priestly families resident, would have had a portion of its agricultural production flowing toward those families through the tithe system, whether or not the families were currently serving at the temple. This created a specific internal economic structure in Bethlehem. The priestly families were, by the logic of the tithe system, the recipients of resources from the other families of the town. They were not merchants or craftsmen. They were religious office holders whose income was defined by institutional entitlement rather than commercial exchange. In the social hierarchy of first-century Jewish communities, priestly status carried enormous prestige, but it also created a specific economic relationship with the non-priestly community that was based on obligation rather than exchange. The Gospel of Luke begins its nativity account in this world. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, is identified as a priest of the division of Abijah, one of the 24 priestly divisions. His wife Elizabeth is identified as a descendant of Aaron, the priestly lineage. Their home is in the hill country of Judea, in the region where Bethlehem sits. The account of the Annunciation to Mary happens while Zechariah is serving at the temple, burning incense in the inner sanctuary. Now, the family structure that the Gospel describes at the beginning of both stories, John's and Jesus's, is embedded in the priestly economy of the Judean highlands. Families with temple obligations, with institutional entitlements, with the specific social identity that the priestly system created. The presence of priestly families in the community also had social consequences that were economic in their practical effects. A priestly family was, by the standards of the period, a family of established status, connected to the temple establishment, entitled to recognition in the community's social hierarchy, and in possession of the specific kind of authority that came from hereditary connection to the sacred. The marriages with priestly families were considered advantageous for non-priestly families with sufficient resources to make such a match possible. The social capital of priestly connection could translate into economic advantages, access to networks, preferential treatment in commercial disputes, the kind of informal favor that small communities distribute along the lines of their acknowledged hierarchies. Bethlehem, in this light, was not only a town of shepherds and grain farmers. It was a community embedded in the institutional life of the temple, connected to its personnel and its economic flows in ways that shaped the daily life of the village, whether or not any individual family was directly involved in temple service. The vine grower and the hospitality economy. The vineyards that climbed the terraced slopes around Bethlehem were a second tier of the town's agricultural economy, distinct from the grain fields and the olive orchards in their seasonal requirements and their market relationships. Grapes ripened in late summer and early autumn, after the grain harvest was stored and before the olive harvest began. The pressing season was therefore a specific, compressed period of collective effort. Families cutting clusters, filling baskets, carrying loads to the treading floor, standing in the large stone vats and treading the grapes in the traditional way, their feet working rhythmically to release the juice that ran down into collection vessels below. The wine produced by Bethlehem's vineyard served multiple markets. The local consumption was the base. Wine diluted with water was the standard drink of daily life throughout the region, safer than untreated water and more caloric than water alone. The surplus, beyond what the producing families and their community needed, could be sold to the Jerusalem market, to merchants on the road south, or to the pilgrimage traffic that passed through the town during festival seasons. Quality varied enormously, and the price differential between ordinary table wine and wine of recognized quality was substantial. A family whose vineyard produced consistently good fruit had an asset with market value beyond the local community. The pressing equipment itself was often communal. A wine press carved into the bedrock of a hillside, the kind documented at hundreds of sites throughout Judea in the archaeological record, was an installation that served multiple families. The use of the press was either shared by the families who had contributed to its construction or rented from whoever owned it. Either way, the pressing season involved communal interaction and negotiation over shared infrastructure, the same social fabric that made agricultural life in small communities possible, and that made the loss of land to outside creditors so disruptive, because the land that moved was not only a productive asset, but a node in the network of communal relationship. The hospitality economy of Bethlehem was directly connected to its wine production. A town on a significant road, receiving travelers, pilgrims, and census registrants needed wine to offer its guests. The provision of wine was not a luxury in the hospitality economy of the ancient Near East. It was an expected element of the table, its absence a mark of inadequate hosting. The families who ran the town's accommodation facilities, those with space in their houses or courtyards to receive travelers, needed to purchase wine if they could not produce enough themselves. The wine producers of Bethlehem had a captive local market in the hospitality operations of their own town. This connection between wine production and hospitality brings us back to the census that overwhelmed Bethlehem's accommodation capacity. The families whose guest rooms were already full when Joseph and Mary arrived were families who had been absorbing guests for days before that night. Their wine supply was being drawn down by a demand that had exceeded their planning. The town was not an inhospitable place. It was a place whose hospitality infrastructure had been pushed past its capacity by an imperial administrative event that produced no revenue for the town and consumed the resources it had prepared for ordinary commercial traffic. The woman of Bethlehem and the domestic economy. No account of how money moved in Bethlehem is complete without attention to the work that made the commercial economy possible, but that the commercial economy did not recognize. The domestic economy managed by the women of the town. The Book of Ruth gives us our most detailed ancient portrait of a woman navigating Bethlehem's economy from the most vulnerable position available. A foreign widow with no land, no male relative of working age, and no established place in the community's network of obligations. Ruth's strategy, gleaning in the fields of Boaz, presenting herself as available for legitimate labor, accepting the social conventions that governed the interaction between a landless woman and a landowner, was not passive. It was active navigation of a specific set of economic rules, using the Torah's provisions for the poor as the mechanism of survival in a landscape where survival required constant calculation. Most women of first-century Bethlehem were in better circumstances than Ruth. They had households, families, established positions in the community's social network. But their economic position was still one of fundamental dependence on the agricultural assets that the household controlled and on the productive capacity of the men who worked those assets. A widow without sons was Ruth's situation. A woman whose husband was incapacitated by illness was a close variant. The household's economic security was precarious in ways that the women who managed it understood more clearly than anyone else, because they were the ones calculating whether the stored grain would last until the next harvest, whether the olive oil supply was adequate for the winter, whether the family could afford to give hospitality to a traveler without disrupting its own provision. Within the household, the economic activity of women was continuous and essential. The grinding of grain, 2 to 3 hours of daily labor to produce the flour for the day's bread, the baking, the preservation of food, the management of the household's water supply in a region where water required carrying, the production of cloth, spinning the raw fiber, weaving on the loom, producing the garments the family wore, and the cloth that could be sold as a secondary income stream. The care of any animals the household kept, chickens, goats, a donkey, that contributed eggs, milk, and transportation to the household's resources. Bethlehem's women were also, in the informal economy of village life, the primary practitioners of the medical knowledge that sustained health in the absence of physicians. The same herbs that grew on the hillsides that the shepherds grazed, hyssop, rue, wormwood, the various plants whose properties had been accumulated in women's knowledge across generations, were processed, prepared, and administered by the women who knew them. This knowledge was economic in the precise sense that it reduced the costs of illness for families that could not afford to lose a working adult to sickness. Its practitioners did not receive wages. Its value was distributed through the network of mutual support that made small communities survivable. The domestic economy of Bethlehem's women was invisible to the census that counted the town's population, invisible to the tax assessors who calculated its tribute, invisible to the temple administrators who collected its tithes. It was also the foundation on which every other economic activity in the town rested. The grain farmer could farm because someone was grinding what he harvested. The shepherd could shepherd because someone was managing the household in his absence. The stone cutter could cut stone because someone was feeding him before he left each morning and caring for the household's needs in his long days away. The economy that the ancient world recognized was built on top of an economy it did not. What the tax collector found when he came. Pull all these economic threads together and you can construct a reasonably precise picture of what a Roman tax assessor would have found in Bethlehem in the years around the birth of Jesus. A town of perhaps 500 people, though some estimates run higher, organized around multiple overlapping economic activities, none of which was individually wealthy enough to make the town prosperous, and all of which were subject to extraction from multiple directions. The shepherds raising temple-quality flocks on the surrounding hills paid for the use of grazing land if they did not own it, paid a portion of their animals as tithe, and sold at prices partially set by the institutional requirements of the temple supply chain, rather than by any free market in which they had leverage. Their labor was skilled and their product was valuable, but the value accrued disproportionately to the distributors and institutions rather than the producers. The grain farmers working the valley floors and the terraced hillsides paid Rome's tribute, the temple tithes, and whatever debt service obligations had accumulated from the bad years. In a landscape where bad years came regularly, drought, locust, hailstorm, the debt service could become permanent. The land that the Torah designated as inalienable family inheritance was, by the 1st century, increasingly concentrated in the hands of creditors in Jerusalem who never set foot on the fields they now owned. The olive growers on the slopes paid the same tithes and faced the same debt exposure as the grain farmers, compounded by the fact that their capital was concentrated in trees that took a decade to mature and that could not be quickly replaced if lost. A family that lost its olive orchard to foreclosure was losing something that could not be rebuilt within a single generation. The cumulative picture that emerges from this survey, Bethlehem's economic actors, is one of a community where productive activity was substantial and varied, where skills were real and valuable, and where the gap between the value produced and the value retained by the producing families was wide and widening. The tax collector who came to assess Bethlehem was assessing a community that had been producing for centuries, that had developed specific expertise in animal husbandry for temple requirements, in highland grain cultivation, in limestone quarrying, in the hospitality trade. And that was surrendering a proportion of all of it large enough to prevent the accumulation that would have allowed families to invest in the next generation of productivity. The stone cutters and craftsmen had cash income that the agricultural families lacked, but that cash income was earned by labor in the building projects of a city that was simultaneously draining the countryside of resources through the tax and tithe system. They were building Jerusalem while Jerusalem was extracting from them. The road traffic through town generated commercial activity, but the families who benefited most from it were those with enough capital to invest in infrastructure, lodging, food supply, animal fodder, while families without that capital could sell their labor as porters or guides, but could not capture the larger margins of the hospitality trade. And through all of it, the Roman tribute assessment ran, the census that Joseph and Mary were traveling to comply with when they arrived in Bethlehem was not a neutral administrative event. It was a tool of the empire's extraction machine, a mechanism for ensuring that every productive person in the province was registered, located, and available for taxation. The family that had traveled from Nazareth to comply with it was doing so because the penalty for non-compliance was potentially severe, and because the empire's reach extended even to Galilean craftsmen who had long since left their ancestral town. The census was the empire saying, "We know where you are from, and we know what you owe, and you will come where we tell you to tell us what we need to know, to take it from you." The night the system did not account for the debt that accumulated in Bethlehem's agricultural families found its physical expression in the changing ownership patterns of the surrounding land. By the 1st century, a significant portion of the agricultural land within the region of Bethlehem and the broader Judean highlands was held by wealthy urban families rather than by the farming families that worked it. The shift from ownership to tenancy was not sudden. It was the accumulation of individual failures. One bad harvest, one unavoidable loan, one year when the debt service exceeded the harvest. Across a generation or two until the pattern was established and the family's connection to the land had been converted from ownership to obligation. The tenant farmer who worked the same field his grandfather had owned paid a third or half of his production in rent to a landlord in Jerusalem who had never plowed a furrow and never would. The economic world of Bethlehem that we have described was a world of predictable patterns. Animals raised, taxed, sold. Grain harvested, tithed, taxed, stored. Oil pressed, traded, exported. Stone cut, transported, assembled into the buildings of the powerful. Roads traveled, tolls paid, commercial services exchanged. The empire took its share. The temple took its share. The creditors took the land when the shares exceeded what the families could bear. None of this system accounts for what Luke's gospel describes happening on a specific night in Bethlehem, when the town was full of people who had come for the census. Yet a birth in the lower level of a house, and in the space shared with the animals because the guest room was occupied, because the town was overwhelmed, to a couple who had traveled from Galilee to comply with an imperial demand. Shepherds on the hillside above the town, keeping watch over flocks that were, in all probability, among the flocks destined for the temple. An announcement that no tax assessor or priestly administrator or Roman census official had prepared for or could have planned. The economic system of Bethlehem, every layer of it, from the shepherd's hillside to the grain field, to the quarry, to the road through town, was organized around extraction, the movement of resources from those who produced them toward institutions and persons who controlled the terms of exchange. It was a system that had been running for decades, but that was running on the night of the birth, and that would continue running for decades afterward. What the system could not do was account for the claim that something had entered it that did not belong to its logic. Not the claim of a new king who would take the throne and redistribute the extraction more fairly. Not the claim of a reformer who would close the legal loopholes that had stripped the families of their land. The claim was more specific and more disruptive than either of those, that the God who had set the terms of the covenant, whose instructions the temple was supposed to follow and whose provisions the law was supposed to protect, had entered the economy of Bethlehem directly. Not through its institutions, but through one of its most ordinary transactions, the birth of a child, to a family that had traveled to comply with an imperial census. The shepherds who received the announcement were already part of Bethlehem's temple supply chain. They would return to their work in the morning. The lambs they were tending would make their way to Jerusalem in due course. The system would continue. But something had been introduced into it that the system had no category for, and that the system would, within 30 years, attempt to eliminate through exactly the same mechanisms of institutional power that had been extracting from Bethlehem's families for generations. The economic history of Bethlehem in the 1st century is, in its structural features, not a unique story, where it is the story of a small agricultural community positioned between two larger systems of extraction, imperial and religious, that both claimed legitimacy and both took more than the community could comfortably give. It is the story of land moving from families to creditors through the patient mechanism of debt in a landscape of uncertain harvests. It is the story of skilled producers, shepherds, farmers, craftsmen, whose labor was valuable and whose share of that value was limited by their position in supply chains they did not control. It is the story of roads and commerce that generated wealth in the hands of those with capital and supplementary income in the hands of those without it. This story has been told in different languages, in different landscapes, with different institutional names. In every century of recorded history, the mechanisms change, the names change, the underlying structure, the extraction of value from producers toward those who control the terms of exchange, the progressive concentration of land and capital, the gap between the legal protections that the stated values of the society offer and the practical conditions its economic system creates. This does not change. It runs as a constant through the human record. What Bethlehem adds to this universal story is a specific detail. It was the place where the tradition that had most directly named this gap and most persistently insisted that God intended to close it, produced a specific claim about when and how the closing would begin. The shepherds, who were part of the temple supply chain, received an announcement. The family that had traveled to comply with the imperial census gave birth in the space reserved for animals, the census that Rome had ordered to optimize its extraction from the province of Judea became, in the tradition that formed around this event, the mechanism by which a prophecy was fulfilled, the one that said Bethlehem, though small among the clans of Judah, would produce a ruler whose origins were from ancient times. The specific combination of industries that Bethlehem operated: animal husbandry for the temple, grain cultivation for subsistence and tribute, olive pressing for the oil trade, stone cutting for Jerusalem's construction, road commerce for the pilgrim traffic, made it a community of multiple interdependencies rather than a single industry town. This diversity was a form of resilience. A bad olive harvest did not destroy the family that also had a grain field and a son in the stone quarries, but it was also a form of multiple exposure. Every industry was subject to its own extraction mechanism, its own seasonal vulnerability, its own institutional relationship with entities more powerful than the producing family. The shepherd was exposed to the temple supply chain. The farmer was exposed to Rome's tribute and the temple tithe simultaneously. The stone cutter was exposed to the boom and bust rhythm of construction projects in Jerusalem that no Bethlehem family could predict or control. The multiplicity of livelihoods was not insulation from the system. It was multiple points of contact with it. The economic system of Bethlehem is still running in its structural features, but in every place in the world where small producers are caught between institutional extractors, where land moves from families to creditors, where the gap between stated values and practiced economics is wide enough to raise the question of whether anything in the current arrangement is sustainable or just. The specific institutions are different. The structural logic is not. What the Bethlehem tradition insists on, and what its economic history makes concrete rather than abstract, is that the gap between promise and reality is not invisible to the God who made the promise, that the shepherd on the hillside above a temple supply chain is not outside the frame of what matters, that the family in the overflow space of a census-overwhelmed town is not below the threshold of significance, that the announcement, when it comes, that comes to the people already doing the work that the system requires and that the system does not adequately recognize. The shepherds went back to their flocks. The lambs made their way to Jerusalem. The stone cutters went back to the quarry. The grain farmers went back to the terraced fields. Bethlehem's economy continued exactly as before, and what had entered it on that night, the claim that the God of the covenant had come to live inside the conditions his people lived in rather than above them, traveled outward from the town's economic margins into the world, carried not by the institutions that the economy served, but by the people the economy used. That is the economic history of Bethlehem. It is also, in its compressed and specific form, the economic history of everywhere.